Next, in attachment are cultural variations on attachment. So this follows on from Ainsworth's study and looks at cultural variations of kind of Ainsworth's work. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that AQA like to ask questions about this section. Students don't do quite as well in it as they should do, and there's some research methods thing that comes up that AQA like to ask about, which we'll come to later on. So just be mindful, if you're explaining and evaluating cultural variations in attachment, this is a favourite of AQA to ask questions about. Now, the main study is by some people whose names I've never learned to say properly in the many years I've been teaching. So it's Van Ijseldoorn and Kroonenberg, which is probably not how you say it. And what they're looking at is they wanted to do a study where they looked at the proportions of the different types of attachment across a range of countries and within some different countries. They're doing a meta-analysis, but they're looking at the different proportions of attachment types in children. So they reviewed 32 studies of attachment where they'd used the strange situation, so where Ainsworth's study had been used. These 32 studies, came from 8 countries. However, 15 of these studies were in America. There were 1,990 children overall, and the data was analysed using a meta-analysis. So that was the research methods procedure that they used. And what they found was this, or a variation of this graph you'll find in the textbooks and you'll find in all the resources. And basically, there's different levels of the different attachment types dependent on which country you are in. So you've got type C, resistant, you've got type A, avoidant, and you've got type B, secure. And if you look, there are different levels of notably resistant children. You've got high levels of resistant children in Japan and Israel, and you've got much higher levels of avoidant children in Germany. That tends to be the country that's used as an example in the questions. And what they found was variations of results within the same country as opposed to between countries. So they found out that it didn't necessarily matter what country you were in, there were differences within the countries as well. And that's a good evaluation point, or that's a good conclusion to write, that they found more variation within countries than between countries. That's the Kroonenberg study is the main study that you should use for cultural variations, but there are some other ones. Simonella's study looked to see whether the proportions of babies in different attachment types matched up to previous studies. They looked at 76 babies using the strange situation. They found a lower rate of secure attachment, and it might be worth thinking about what study. So in Italy, what country they did the study in, and the methods that they used, because that might have affected the results that they found. So you can use Simonella's study for evaluation. If you look, it's in your textbook. We've got a study by Jin, which compares the proportions of the attachment types in Korea to the other studies. It's looking at the strange situation in 87 children. It found that most of the children that were insecurely attached were resistant, and only one was avoidant. This is very similar to the results in Japan. You might want to think why this might be. It's the cultural practices, the child rearing practices in that area of the world. You might want to talk about the sample. So again, this is an extra study that you can use. I would use these extra studies as AO3. I would stick to the Kroonenberg study as your kind of main study of cultural variations. However, what you can say is secure attachment seems to be the norm in a wide range of cultures. Overall, it's the most common attachment type, supporting Bowlby's idea that attachment is innate, so it's inbuilt and universal, and this type is the universal norm, so it's like a cultural universal that applies to everyone. However, the research, Kroonenberg study and the other studies show that cultural practices or specific countries have an influence on attachment type. So there's the Ainsworth idea that you've got these 3 distinct attachment types, and securely attached is the most common. That seems to apply cross-culturally. It supports Bowlby's idea that we have an inbuilt desire to form an attachment, and this is a universal thing. However, there are some variations between countries and within countries. So it's not just nature, it's not just this inbuilt desire to form an attachment. There's also influences of nurture, kind of which country you are in. I've put together some examples of evaluation points that you could use. So you can discuss the fact that the Kroonenberg study was a meta-analysis. I'll give you a definition of what that is shortly. You could say it's a limitation that the samples are not representative. You could say it's a limitation that the method has a cultural bias. It assumes an imposed ethic, that everyone's culture is the same. And you could suggest that temperament of the children was a confounding variable that wasn't taken into account. I've then elaborated these evaluation points for you, or I've given you some starter sentences if you want to elaborate them further. So you could get a 16-mark question on cross-cultural variations and attachment. If you did, you would need 3 elaborated AO3 points. Try to make sure that one is an issue in debate, and you can use any of these. So I've given you kind of the framework, and you can elaborate on them in your notes. Use the booklets and use your textbooks. You should be able to elaborate on these. So this is the one about meta-analysis. And there's a slightly longer version for you. You could talk about the limitations that the samples aren't representative. And again, there's an extended version for you. Just to say, if you're making these, if you're copying this into your notes, don't just copy it without an understanding of it. Don't copy anything down if it doesn't make sense. Make sure that it makes sense, or else you won't be able to replicate it in an exam. You can talk about the fact it's biased towards American or British cultures. Remember, it's Ainsworth design. So there's the elaboration on that. And then temperament as a confounding variable. Something like that can be used as well. Remember, you would only need 3 elaborated AO3 for a 16-mark. Try to make sure that at least either one is an issue in debate or you link to an issue in debate. Now, the Van Oostendorp and Kroonenberg study is liked by AQA because it uses a meta-analysis. So AQA can ask you about this in terms of research methods, and they can also sneak some research methods in to attachment because they link it to this Kroonenberg study. So common questions you could be asked what's meant by a meta-analysis or what it is. You could be asked why a meta-analysis is the most suitable approach for this study, so why it's the best approach to use. Or you could even be asked to evaluate meta-analyses. So you could be asked for a strength or a weakness of a meta-analysis. All of this could come up either in research methods, and you would link it back to this Kroonenberg study because it's the easiest one to remember, that's a meta-analysis, or this could come up in attachment because that's the direct link to this cultural variation study. So it's just worth noting a meta-analysis assesses trends in data and evaluates the effect across studies. So it takes lots of research and sees whether there's a trend in that research. It can increase the validity of conclusions, it can make them more valid because you have a wider sample of participants, because you can look at overall patterns, even if some studies kind of contradict or disagree with each other. However, it's hard to compare studies directly because the research designs might be different. So you can argue the studies might not be comparable. So you still need to check the validity. It's a fairly valid way to draw a conclusion, but you still need to check the validity. This is another type of exam question that you commonly get when you talk about cross-cultural variations, where they give you some data and some graphs, and they ask you to work out some math. So this one is asking for a percentage difference. It's asking you for the modal, so the most common attachment type in Germany, and then it's asking you for a limitation. So these are the kind of questions that you might expect. The other more common type of question on cross-cultural variations, if you haven't got a 16-mark, an 8 or a 16-mark essay question, you haven't got a question that just asks you about meta-analysis, you haven't got a question that asks you about data like this, you might get an AO2 kind of STEM question. So this is, so Yumi's 18 months old. She's just moved from Japan to the UK on a first day at nursery. She cries and her mother leaves and won't allow the helpers to comfort her. Briefly discuss cultural variations in attachment. Make reference to Yumi's behaviour in your answer. So briefly discuss. So briefly describe and evaluate cultural variations in attachment. So discuss is AO1 and AO3. You've got the STEM, so you've got the child they're talking about, so that's AO2. So if for 8 marks, you've got AO1, AO2, and AO3. So you would expect 3 marks for your AO1, 2 marks for your AO2, and 3 marks for your AO3. So it's quite a lot to write in order to get kind of near the 8 marks. So you're describing cultural variations in attachment. So Kroonenberg study, or the concept behind Kroonenberg study. You're evaluating cultural variations in attachment, so 1 point to evaluate Kroonenberg's research, and you're referencing the child in there, and you're getting 2 marks for that. So how you would structure the answer to something like this is so you start with your AO1, so you would describe cultural variations in attachment, so perhaps describe Kroonenberg's research. For your AO2, you link it to the STEM, and I've done that for you, just an example, because I know some of you struggle with that. And then for your AO3, you would have 1 evaluation point that would kind of evaluate the concept of cross-cultural variations in attachment. There is a series of videos online by PsychBoost. I put the link to them here if you want to go back over them and look at attachment stuff, if you kind of want to look at anything in a bit more detail.